Hello and welcome to the Phuket Stories podcast. I'm your moderator, Saigon Steve. On this special podcast episode, we'll talk with military personnel and talk with them about their extraordinary experiences. This podcast is pre-recorded, but you're invited to participate on future podcasts by emailing your contact information to PhuketStories@gmail.com. That's PhuketStories@gmail.com. So let's get started with today's special guest. Today we're talking with Tom Olson. Tom Olson spent 24 active years in the United States Navy in the submarine service, exclusively with nuclear submarines. He retired as a captain. However, as a civilian, he oversaw the construction of many nuclear submarines. Tom is now a docent at the Submarine Force Library and Museum in Groton, Connecticut. His naval career is very impressive. Tom will now tell us how it all began. Tom?
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to be talking to you today. My Navy career did start a little bit unique. I was at Bradley University out in Peoria, Illinois, back in the 1973 timeframe. I was graduating college early in December of 73 and was still under the draft. I was number 37, and my draft board was telling me, if you come out of school, your number is already up, and we're going to send you off to get drafted. And so I said, well, I got to take a look at my options here, and I got Time Magazine in the mail, and I saw that they got a little card there, join the nuclear Navy, and I said, well, that sounds kind of interesting. So I sent the card in. They got right back to me and said, come down to Chicago and take a bunch of tests. I got a phone call from the recruiters and says, hey, we're sending tickets to Washington, D.C. tonight so that you can have some interviews for getting into the nuclear power program. Best of luck. Let me know how everything works out. And so I get on the plane that afternoon, fly to Washington, D.C., and they put us all in this big room with a big table, and there's these stacks of green books all around it. It says, you can have your lunch, feel free to read anything you want here. Well, it's all the testimony of Admiral Rickover, his congressional testimonies books. Not too interesting. But they have another guy comes in, there's another little board with a map on it. It says, here's the room where you're going to go see the Admiral. You're going to walk in here, and there's the desk and a chair. And you're going to sit down in the chair and just answer the Admiral's question. And when I tap you on the shoulder, you stand up no matter what the Admiral's saying and just follow me back out the door. And then another guy gives us the same story. Another guy gives us the same story. So make sure that 3 times we get this thing. Then a fourth guy comes along and says, this is really a great program. It's the best thing since sliced bread. It's done a lot for me. And look at me, I'm the governor of Georgia now. And I kind of scratch my head, who's this guy? And the guy next to me says, oh, that's Governor Jimmy Carter from Georgia. Okay, sounds nice. I didn't know at the time that he knew Rickover as well as he did, but obviously he's done well for himself as he became president of the United States a few years later. Anyway, I'm the second person in line for the afternoon here getting called in to go. I go in, I go sit down, follow a guy in, sit down at the chair. Rickover is sitting behind almost like a rocking chair, painted this really weird color green, gray desk with this pile with papers, and there's file cabinets all around him and stuff, and he's sitting down there reading and writing and stuff and doesn't even look up at me. And the first thing out of his mouth is, where are you from? Libertyville, Illinois, I answer. We're in Libertyville. 412 Meadow Lane. Why do they call it Meadow Lane? I said, I don't know. I guess it was a meadow and some cows and stuff. He says, that's bullshit. And then the next thing I get tapped on the shoulder. I stand up and I leave. And that's my whole interview with Admiral Rickover. 3 questions, but quite the experience. But that's the story of how I got into the Navy. It's kind of interesting. It's a little bit of fun there. Important day, but it's really burned in my memory today, here almost 50 years later.
In your nuclear power training unit, are they looking for people that think outside the box, or are they looking for people that have great memorization of how the nuclear world works?
I'd say they're looking for people that have a good understanding of what the limits of the box are, how the box works, and then how to follow the procedures to have the box do what you want it to do, better than sticking outside of it. They want you to stay within the box.
So now you're trained in nuclear power aboard submarines, and they put you aboard nuclear subs. Tell us about that experience.
Well, after you finish your nuclear power training, you actually have 5 more weeks. I had 5 more weeks of submarine training, where you learn how to drive the submarine, because they don't teach you that in the nuclear power. It's just how to run the reactor portion of it. But you now need to learn how to drive the submarine, to have it go to different depths, how to use the periscopes, how to navigate with the special navigation systems that are on submarines. So that's another 5 weeks of school. Then you transfer on board. You actually end up on your first submarine, which in my case was the USS William H. Bates here in New London. It was a fast attack submarine, and once you get on board as an ensign, you have 1 year to get what they call your dolphins. To do that, that's your submarine qualification, and whether you're an officer or enlisted, it's a 1 year time limit that you're given. And in that time frame, you have to qualify as an engineering duty officer, go back and run the reactor plant as a senior officer on watch all the time. But similar, you have to also qualify as a diving officer and as a conning officer to drive the submarine, both surfaced and submerged. So there's 4 different qualifications you have to do over that 1 year period. And that's all on-the-job training. You stand under instruction watch with another officer that's senior to you, that's been on board, that already has his dolphins, and you learn all the ins and outs of the operations and the different procedures you have to follow to do different evolutions, whether it's driving the ship in and out of port, whether it's submerging the ship, whether it's rigging it for dives, whether it's doing special operations with the SEALs or helo operations, or transiting at certain depths and certain speeds. There's a lot, and how to navigate under the ice. And so there's a lot of different things you do to learn for those different qualifications. And so it takes a full year to do that, of additional training, on-the-job training. In parallel with still having regular officer duties of a division. In my case, it was the electrical division for 6 months, and then the communications division for 6 months, having 8 or 10 of the enlisted folks reporting to you as the officer, and you're the leader for them as far as getting their maintenance done, their qualifications done, and solving their problems with their wives and children and everything else that comes along with being a division officer.
You know, you talk about the periscope training. In the movies, when they up periscope and the captain starts looking through the viewfinder of the periscope, he starts at the bottom. As it is rising upward, he is following it with his eyes glued to the periscope viewfinder all the way up to it locks into place. Why do they start at the bottom?
Part of it is that as the ship is coming up, you're looking for shapes and shadows to make sure you're not on a collision course with something. Because if you see something, the sooner you can get that observation as the ship is still coming up, it's still under the water, but it's getting close to the surface, you can actually see shapes and shadows of another ship or somebody that's up on the surface here, so that you don't run into it. And they're ships that are silent, because we, as a submarine, you rely totally on noise to tell you that something's out there. So if somebody's up there on the surface, silent, his engine's off, not making any noise, you don't know that it's there. So you're looking for that as you're coming up onto the surface. And so that's always a high-risk evolution for the ship, is to proceed to periscope depth. That's the time you can get. You want to get on it. You get as big and fast and as early a look as possible to see what's in front of you. That's really, before that, you have no idea if there's anything that's silently running up there or silently sitting on the surface where you're heading.
Do members of the nuclear submarine force spend most of their time underwater, or are you going to different ports around the world?
You could be out to sea for like 2 months straight, okay, and then make a port call for a week or two, and then go back out to sea again for another month or 6, 7 weeks, come back into port for a week. It really varied, but there's not a lot of planning that's done in advance. It's kind of haphazard. They'll try to get you a 3-week period in there to do some maintenance in the middle of that of your 6-month deployment, but that's not guaranteed because you're really driven by what the operations are. They're typically are very classified and stuff, whether you're what you're doing, monitoring other submarine operations, you're doing surveillance, you're launching Tomahawk missiles wherever. So there's a lot of variability. In my case, during the Cold War period back in the 1970s, I was deployed on an average of the 3 years I was on board the ship, 312 days a year. I was out of my home port, either at sea or for a mass majority of that, or in a foreign port someplace. And it wasn't that many times. I can still count on my fingers how many times I was in port. And it was only like in Holylock, Scotland, or Bremerhaven, Germany, or Naples, Italy. Very few places that you can get to for a submarine.
I understand you were also a weapons officer on the nuclear submarine, and they do have drills. But what happens during the drills where you have to go to the safe and the launch codes? Can you take us through that?
A little bit, yeah. On my second and third ship, I was the USS Robert E. Lee out of Pearl Harbor, and with deployments out of Guam. The off crew was in Pearl Harbor, and the ship deployed out of Guam. And likewise for the USS Kaiser Pulaski, that was home ported in Charleston with deployments out of Kings Bay, Georgia. As a weapons officer, I was responsible for both the torpedoes as well as the Polaris and Trident missile systems. And we do all the maintenance on things as well as doing regular drills. These could be every other day. Sometimes it's only once a week. And we would be tasked when get into what they call an alert status. And there's 4 different levels of alert, and they're all called SQ levels, 1 through 4. With 1 SQ being the highest, where you're actually launching a missile, and 4 SQ means that the system is all shut down and you can come into port. And then you get the weapon system ready as far as putting batteries in, preloading the launch coordinates, and all this type of stuff in these different levels for the SQ levels. And so we would get to these conditions, and then you would get an emergency action message would come in and says, this is either a drill or this is a real action. So most things come in as a drill, and so it would be all on the message. But they would still have to go through, and they would still give you a target package. They would still give you all the launch codes, and that are in the drill, because you have 2 packages. You have the drill package of launch codes, and then you have the real ones. And so every time we're doing it, so the message comes in, there's a group of 2 officers get the message, decipher it because it all comes encoded, and then there's these sealed codes that are inside a double-lock safe. Each guy has 1 combination to get into the safe, and then they would validate, and there's these coupons in there that are all sealed. You break open the seal, and it has a code in there, and that matches with the code that came in with the message to validate that this is an authentic, what they call authenticated message, with the directions for that execution of that target package. And then that would be then validated by the captain, and then he would then put a key into the weapons launch console. I would bring out the trigger from again in a safe that I had the only combination for, and then I'd verify that target packages have been properly loaded, and then he would give me launch authority, and then I would give the trigger, and then the directions for the fire control technicians to launch the individual missiles. In a drill, we actually go through the launch sequence, but you're in a launch mode for the whole thing, so it doesn't actually send signals to the firing units. It sends missiles to the gimbals and for the in the warheads and stuff to make sure that they're working properly and that they're all properly aligned and all that stuff. So you're getting an end-to-end check of the missile and stuff, with the exception of the firing unit to launch the missile. Now you got to realize on these missiles, these are big missiles, that they actually have a steam generator on the bottom of the missile tube that the missile is sitting on, generates a big bubble of steam, and that actually pushes the missile up out because it's in a bubble of nitrogen gas. And after you open the hatch on the upper hatch on the missile, that pushes the missile out, and it actually accelerates so fast that it actually broaches the water. It comes all the way out of the water, and when it starts slowing down and descending, then the missile senses that deceleration, and that sends a signal to light off a first stage rocket motor, which is all a solid propellant. But then and that's what you see a big plume in the launch movies and stuff of the missiles. That big launch plume, and that's why you see it so much, because it's not under the water; it's all outside the water, above the water. It's a very intense system. They've launched hundreds of these missiles now over the years because the program has been in place since the 1960s with the first ship, USS George Washington.
It sounds like there's a lot of safety procedures in place on United States submarines. What about our adversaries? Do they have the same safety procedures?
From what we can tell, I have no experience working with the Russian submarines. They've been very dark in what they wanted to know, but we do know from as the general public and what's available is that typically there's been a lot more accidents with the Russian submarine fleet. Most recently with the Kursk, probably is the most well-versed fleet known here recently, where a torpedo basically blew up the front end of the submarine, and there were still people on board. They couldn't get to it to recover those folks, and they basically suffocated because of the lack of air and stuff. They did recover the whole ship and brought it into a dry dock weeks or months later. So those kind of incidents, we have a much better track record. We have from a nuclear submarines, there's been 2 submarine losses for the United States Navy. One is the USS Thresher, and the other one is the USS Scorpion. Scorpion, we don't know a lot about. It happened in 1968. The other ship was the Thresher I mentioned, when it was lost back in April of 1963. But in the case of Thresher, it went through, and we were able to recover it afterwards. It looked like it's been postulated right now in the Navy, in the actual investigation reports that were done, and it's just being declassified now. You can read through those online and stuff. But basically, the story goes is that the ship appears to have had a major leak in one of the systems that was brazed. From that, we've developed what we call a submarine safety program, where they go back and redesign a lot of these systems. They changed how fast we can recover the reactor compartment. We put special enclosures for the electrical plants. We got rid of the sill brazing. It's all welded piping right now, and it's all X-rayed. We put an additional 4 air banks in there that will all have much larger diameter with only one valve to allow for what's called emergency main ballast tank blow system. And they put requirements as far as on how dry that air has to be that goes into those air tanks. And then we take a look at the whole design structure, and we try to minimize the number of hull connections. We're down to 6 right now on the newest submarines, for the 2 inlet and outlet to the main condensers to the port and starboard side, and then an inlet and outlet for what they call the after cooling systems for all the other supplemental cooling systems. So the ships has been designed much differently. There's much more taking a look at the parts and the heritage of those, and make sure we're always using the right parts, the right drawings, what they call objective quality evidence, or OQE, and people are signing for everything that affects the subsafe envelope of the hull and these seawater systems. And there's also a whole maintenance program that goes along to exercise those systems and what they call re-entry control. So anytime you enter into that system to do maintenance, it's all properly documented and reviewed and using the right parts. So it's quite an extensive system, and it's costly, but we've had a very good success rate. There's been no failures or sinkings or loss of life or anything. So we'll just keep knocking on wood and hope that the folks continue the high standards that they've been trained to do and have been executing over these past 60 years.
My preparation for interviewing Tom Olson, who is an encyclopedia about submarines. I mean, most of the people listening to this who are not in the submarine service, all they know is what they saw in the movies, Run Silent, Run Deep, or the comedy Operation Petticoat, I believe that was the name of the movie, or that's all we know.
Yes.
But you lived it and breathed it. And in preparation for this interview, I came across on the internet an article called 30 Things We Didn't Know About Life on a Submarine. I don't want to go through all 30 of these with you, but I would like to go through a lot of these and give me in 25 words or less the topic, and we can discuss them for our audience and be better acquainted with life aboard a submarine. You ready?
Sure.
Okay, prior to 2014, the submarine force had 18-hour days in which sailors stood watch for 6 hours and had 12 hours off for other duties as well as sleep. So what's happening today? Is it still that way?
It's a prerogative of the individual commanding officer, but most of the ships are shifting to an 8-hour watch rotation now. So you're doing 8 hours on, the same with that rotation for over 3 shifts a day. So it makes it a little bit easier. People seem to enjoy it. And with the amount of flexibility that they have, being able to go to the bathrooms and that type of stuff, getting breaks with other watchstanders coming in to relieve you for a couple minutes on your watch, you can do the 8 hours and still maintain everything. So most of the crews have shifted over to that, but it's at the discretion of the commanding officer.
Okay, let's talk about sharing bunks.
Well, most ships have fleet of Virginia-class submarines, the attacks, of 135 bunks, but they typically go to sea with about 150 people. And that's because they bring extra trainees and riders for specific missions, like an acoustic guy or an electronics guy. So they'll bring extra people on board for training. And so those extra people, normally the most junior people end up once they do all the bunk assignments, having 3 people share 2 bunks, and that's called hot racking. That's been in place since the Nautilus, because it was the same situation. On Nautilus, they had 117 bunks and went to sea with 150 people. So to go under the pole for the first time, it was kind of interesting talking to the guys that did that when they had their reunion here a few years ago here up in New London.
Submarines can be submerged for weeks or months. You rarely see daylight or nightfall. What's that all about?
In my case, the longest I've been submerged was 113 days straight. The only time people saw daylight or nightfall was the officer deck when he looked out the periscope. Sometimes I was the officer deck, so it was nice. But otherwise, you got used to it pretty good. But you got to learn on how to live under artificial light for a long time.
In submarines, they have lower levels of oxygen in the ship. How's that done?
You have 2 things that you can do. You can do natural ventilation, where you actually come up to periscope depth, raise your snorkel mask, and suck in. We have a special blower that bring air into the submarine, so you can still get some fresh air every so often. But if you're in operations that prevents you from getting to periscope depth, or that you want to remain quiet, what we'll do is we have oxygen generators on board that basically separate, just like your high school science experiment, through electrolysis. You get hydrogen and oxygen in 2 little test tubes there. We're able to do the same thing on a much larger scale, taking pure water, electrolyzing, and then we pump the hydrogen overboard and pump the oxygen into a tank and then bleed it back into the ship to keep our oxygen levels, which are monitored on an hourly basis, at the appropriate levels to keep us in a natural atmosphere.
Here's a topic called sleeping with nukes. What's it like sleeping right next to a massively destructive weapon?
I luck as an officer, I didn't really have to do that much, but a lot of the enlisted guys, because what we'll do is we'll actually, in the torpedo room, we'll either download the number of weapons sometimes if we know our operations is more focused on intelligence gathering rather than chasing submarines and having to utilize those weapons. We'll take and put extra bunks on board. We'll get from 135, maybe we'll get another 5 racks in there. So those guys will be in a torpedo typically, because that's where there's room to put them, and put racks in there. And so you'll be sleeping literally next to a torpedo or a nuclear weapon if the ship is carrying nuclear weapons.
Free time in the mess hall. I understand the mess hall is a very important part of submarine service.
Right. Well, it's the one area that is large enough to gather more than 2 people in a location, because some of the staterooms you can only have 2 people standing up in it. And most of the bunk rooms have 9 people in them, and you're all literally standing. But in the mess hall, there's tables. You can have about almost half the crew can cram in there. So that's where our meals are served, where they'll do training. There'll be mission briefings, and also in the movies. That's the one place where a lot of things can happen, and it also is a good staging area for casualty operations. So the damage control team will be stationed there to have all their equipment and everything to go out to fight a fire or some type of steam casualty. So be able to get all the equipment there it provides an extra space.
Well, here's a topic that the movies don't show: minimal bathroom space.
There's 12 officers on board, but 2 of them, the captain and the XO, and they share one bathroom and a shower. So the other 9 officers share one toilet and one shower. The shower is maybe 20 inches by 20 inches. And that's standard, and likewise for the enlisted. And then what they do is they'll have 3 sinks, 2 showers, and 3 toilets, and that'll support about 50 people. And you have 3 stations like that throughout the ship. So it's tough, particularly for the enlisted guys, to be able to have any type of level of privacy.
There's also an issue in the hallways aboard the submarine. They're very tight.
Yeah, they're only designed for one person walking, and so when you run into somebody, you have to turn sideways and kind of edge yourself on the main passageways. And there's not a lot, because that same main passageway is also torn up to bring the torpedoes down. So sometimes you don't even have that. So you have to kind of work around circuitous routes to get it from the forward to aft around the submarine, working through different compartments around equipment and all this type of stuff. So it's still tight even today on nuclear submarines, and it was extremely tight back during the World War II submarines.
And let's conclude this list with women aboard submarines. Back in 2010, they started having women in the U.S. submarine force. What's that like today?
When the women are on board the submarine, I've had a lot of interfacing with particularly the crews here that have women in new construction. We had a group of 3 of them for the USS Colorado at new construction. You can't tell the difference. They're integrated right in with the crew. As a junior officer, they're responsible and is very knowledgeable, are extremely proficient, and I have the great honor every couple of months of being a speaker at the graduation ceremonies. And typically, the last ceremony I just did last month, there's 120 ensigns going to the fleet here coming out of submarine school. 11 of those were women. So they're fairly well integrated, about 10% of the fleet right now, and we're seeing very good success. As you mentioned, it started in 2010, so those women right now have been in 12 years, or coming up on their 12-year in service, which they'll be just starting to go into the XO. Some of them have already served their engineer tours, 2 short duties, and are now ready to come back as an XO. And the first of those women should be coming up here very shortly in the pipeline. So we're still a few years away, probably another 4 years or so, before you see a woman commanding officer of a submarine, but that day is coming very quickly.
We're talking with Tom Olson, and Tom has on his business card, Acquisition Emeritus, Supervisor of Shipbuilding, Groton, Connecticut. And there's a quote that Tom said. He said, "I oversaw the technical specifications of the Navy that they demanded for its submarine shipbuilding. But the flip side was, how are we going to pay for all of this?" It says here that Tom Olson spent $2.7 billion, that's with a B, $2.7 billion on building nuclear submarines. Tell us about that, Tom.
The supervisor of shipbuilding, first off, is the office that is embedded at Electric Boat here, where the submarines are built and contracted for. Supervisor's office are the people that write the check. They're the people that provide the quality assurance oversight and checking off certain things that have to be accepted by the government. They have an engineering group that reviews all the drawings and approves them for the government. We have contracting people that do the changes, and the program guys that interface getting the crew and the company together and keep those lessons learned going. And I served here at the supervisor's office for about 18 years as a Navy civilian, and I actually volunteer. That's what I'm doing today here. I'm actually in the offices here of the supervisor's shipbuilding doing a special submarine safety audit today. The amount of time and effort that I've had in my experiences here working with the government is being able to provide that oversight and writing the checks and stuff for to get Electric Boat their billings on time, because they bill us for a total cost of $2.7 billion for a brand new Virginia-class submarine is what it costs, what we contract for. From a cost perspective, the ship builders have been doing a pretty good job of it, because it takes between 5 and 6 years to deliver a new nuclear submarine. The way these ships are built right now is that the ship is built in there's 5 sections to a Virginia-class submarine. You have the reactor that's built at Electric Boat here in Groton, the engine room and the habitability modules that has the torpedo room and stuff. Those are built up at Quonset Point, Rhode Island, and as a module and shipped down to Groton. And then the bow and the stern and the sail are built down in Newport News, and then those are shipped up here to Groton. Likewise, the next submarine that's being built, Electric Boat will build that same engine room and habitability section and send that down to Newport News. Newport News will build their reactor compartment and build their own bow, stern, and sail and assemble that and then launch the submarine from down in Newport News. So that we're maintaining, that helps bring the costs down. And it also keeps both shipbuilders nuclear proficient, as well as lessons sharing constructor to constructor in the company as far as being able to have efficiency of building the same module all the time. And that helps bring that cost down. That's how come we can get these things relatively for a fast attack at $2.7 billion. But the bad side here is that the cost for the first of the class, for the new Columbia class, which will be 2.5 times the size, is probably going to be around $7 billion per hull when we start getting in production on those. So submarines are expensive, but there's a lot of technology and there's a lot of stealth that goes into being able to project America's might and getting the information that we need to be able to defend ourselves away from America's home shores here and taking the fight to the enemy.
Well, there's only one way to end this interview, and that's to say it was a heck of a story and what a great career you had with the United States Navy and what you're doing now as a civilian. Tom Olson, thank you for your service.
Thank you, and I appreciate the time and opportunity to speak with you today, and hope I provided some useful information to folks to learn more about the submarine service in the United States Navy.
Well, that wraps up another special episode of FUCAT Stories. If you'd like to participate in a future FUCAT Stories podcast, email your contact information to fucatstories@gmail.com. That's fucatstories@gmail.com. Until next time, thanks for listening to the FUCAT Stories podcast. I'm Saigon Steve.